Do you think of yourself as having a particular kind of philosophy because you are an American, or an American Indian, or of Hungarian or Chinese or Latin American ethnic origin? Or because you are a woman? Or because you are black? Does belonging to a particular social group affect the philosophy one has? Do different social groups give rise to different philosophical outlooks on the world, different ways of perceiving reality? If this is your viewpoint, you agree with Hegel, Marx, and Sartre, who all take this position, following the Kantian turn in philosophy with its claim that whatever is experienced or known is in part due to our own minds, our own way of thinking. In the modern world, it has often been observed that France, England, and Germany, these three great national groupings, have each of them developed its own characteristic philosophy, its own way of viewing the world. The characteristic philosophy which arose in France, and which remains in many ways the typical philosophy of France, is the continental rationalism of which the French philosopher Descartes is the supreme example. The British also developed their own characteristic way of philosophizing, the philosophy usually called British empiricism, of which Hume is the outstanding example. Similarly, there developed in Germany, beginning with Kant and the Romantics, a type of philosophy which is regarded as characteristically German, and for that reason is usually called German idealism, and Hegel is its preeminent example. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in the same year as Beethoven and the English Romantic poet Wordsworth. Hegel was the oldest of three children in a middle-class family in the town of Stuttgart in southern Germany. The family's roots had been in Austria, but they, like other Protestants in the 16th century, fled from persecution by Catholics in Austria to the safety of Lutheran Protestant territories in Germany. Hegel's father was a minor civil servant. All that appears to be known about his mother is contained in a reference to her high intelligence and her unusual learning for a woman of that time and place. Uneventfully, he went through the schooling conventional for his social class, and after he was graduated from the Stuttgart Gymnasium in October of 1788, he entered the famous Theological Seminary nearby at the University of Tübingen to study theology for the Protestant ministry. Tübingen Evangelical Theological Seminary is located in the buildings of an old Augustinian monastery on a cliff overlooking the river Neckar, surrounded by hills and with the snow-topped craggy peaks of the Alps in the distance. At Tübingen, in the academic year of 1790-91, Hegel shared the dormitory on the top floor of the old seminary tower with his friend Hölderlin, who was to become one of Germany's major poets, and with Schelling, who quickly became famous, earlier than Hegel, as a German idealist philosopher. After Tübingen, there followed long, hard years of struggle to earn a living and to develop as a philosopher. Hegel's first university position as a philosopher was at the University of Jena from 1801 to 1807, where he began as an unsalaried lecturer, being paid by a few of the students who attended. From 1802 on, Hegel had repeatedly announced a forthcoming book, year after year. Having delayed so long, he angered his publisher and ended up having to finish the manuscript in October of 1806, while the army of Napoleon was attacking the town of Jena. Is it part of a legend that the last pages are said to have been written on the night of October 12th to the 13th, the night of the final Battle of Jena, in which the French, under the invincible Napoleon, defeated the Prussian army and conquered Prussia, the most powerful territory in Germany? On October 13th, 1806, the city of Jena was captured, and Napoleon entered the walled city. Hegel wrote about the event to a friend and benefactor with these words of hero worship of Napoleon. "I saw the emperor, that world soul, riding out to reconnoiter the city. It is truly a wonderful sensation to see such an individual, concentrated here on a single point, astride a single horse, yet reaching across the world and ruling it." A week later, on October 20th, his house was plundered by the soldiers of the invading French army. There was no winter semester for Hegel, and no longer a teaching position at the University of Jena. The book, however, had been finished. The book was The Phenomenology of Spirit. It is now regarded as exemplifying the writing of the young Hegel, and usually is contrasted with his Philosophy of Right, published in 1821, which is regarded as exemplifying the mature or the late Hegel. The book is one of the great works of genius that Western civilization has produced, but it is difficult, conceptually and stylistically, and in some parts almost impossible to penetrate. A few critics have protested that it is deliberately obscure. Hegel had thought deeply about what his approach would be. But what was available to the young Hegel? What philosophical viewpoints were present in his historical time, the first years of the 19th century, and in his place, the university life of Prussian Germany? There were, first of all, French rationalism and British empiricism, and beyond these, and synthesizing them, was the formidable philosophy of the German philosopher Kant, which had been the capstone of the Enlightenment philosophy. But there was also a newer philosophy which had appeared in Germany, and this was a viewpoint called Romanticism. What was German Romanticism? It was a revolutionary movement in the realm of literature, philosophy, and the visual arts, rather than in the realm of politics. It was a wholly new way of looking at the world, which arose with a great burst of creative energy on the part of German artists and intellectuals who rejected the Enlightenment as a philosophy confined to and dominated by reason, by mathematics, logic, mathematically formulated scientific laws, and by the abstract natural rights. They were disillusioned with the promises of progress and the perfectibility of the human race made by the Age of Optimism. What then did Romanticism have to offer in place of the philosophy of the Enlightenment? Well, it had to offer these 5 things. First, the inward path. Romanticism was fortified by the Kantian turn in philosophy, and this opened up for the German Romantics the inward path to truth, the new horizon for philosophy, in which the path to truth is through the world within, since it imposes its thought upon what is found in the outside world. It was in the inner world of the self that truth and the meaning of the human condition was to be found, not the external world of the physical sciences. Like French existentialism of the 20th century, German Romanticism of the early 19th century used literature, novels, poems, dramas, essays, short stories, to express the inner world of human feelings and to offer powerful protest against the philosophies which ignore them. The second is the quest for the totality of experience. Science is far from exhausting the complexities of human existence, they argued. The real world contains much more than science can disclose. It is the totality of experience, its joys and sorrows, growth and change, paradoxes and fulfillments, that the Romantics longed for, and that they demanded philosophy to seek to understand. To understand the world, we must go to experience as it is lived, not merely to the empiricist's sense perceptions, or to the rationalist's clear and distinct ideas. We must explore the dark, hidden areas of the mind, and the realms of feeling and imagination. We must discover the inner workings of the human spirit, and the way it relates to nature, society, history, and God. The ideal for the philosopher is not to be confined to the narrow territory of science, but to be always in pursuit of the fullness of meaning, always in quest of the elusive blue flower, the symbol created by the poet Novalis for the yearning love of beauty beyond the infinite. The third, the primacy of will. To the Romantics, what is of supreme reality and value in human nature is not reason, but the will of the human individual. The will strives for self-fulfillment, and can find this only in the striving for infinity. The will seeks to possess the totality of experience, of nature, history, and culture, ascending from human finitude to the divinely infinite. It strives endlessly, as did Goethe's Faust, to experience, to enjoy the concrete fullness of totality. It was the romantic yearning for every experience, for infinity, that led Faust to sell his soul to the devil. The fourth, nature as spirit. The Romantics protested that the real is spiritual, not material, as Enlightenment had claimed. In the literature of Romanticism, nature is spiritualized. Nature is no gigantic mechanical clockwork operating by Newtonian laws, but is instead a living spirit, a vast will, and a wiser teacher than a scientific treatise. In communion with nature is wisdom to be found. This is the message of the English Romantic poet Wordsworth. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. Behind natural phenomena, the Romantic poet intuits an all-encompassing great will, a spiritual power. God is not the engineer-designer of the world machine, as the Enlightenment deists claim. God is the indwelling soul of the universe. The fifth is romantic polarity. Finally, the Romantics celebrated two-sidedness, polarity, ironic reversals, as in the French Revolution and its outcome, which, they said, characterized human thought and feeling, and the entire realm of human history. The romantic ideal is to experience both sides of every polarity, and never to become rigid or static, never to become confined, the prisoner of any one mode of thought or way of life, but always to be in pursuit of the infinite. "Insofar as I am static, I am enslaved," proclaimed Goethe's Faust. When Hegel entered the Tübingen Evangelical Theological Seminary, where he studied philosophy and theology for 5 years, these intoxicating ideas of Romanticism were in the air. Which of the 3 kinds of philosophical viewpoints and methods would Hegel use? Romanticism, the philosophy of spirit, will, and endless polarity? Or the rationalism and empiricism of science, progress, and natural rights of the French philosophes? Or the Kantian philosophy? He would use elements from all 3. Like the Romantics, whose influence pervades his thought despite his frequent attacks on it, Hegel is looking for a philosophy that will reach to infinity, encompass all human experience, incorporate all knowledge, science, history, religion, politics, art, literature, architecture. How to bring these vast reaches of the human spirit into systematic logical unification in a theory. He will do this with his concept of absolute mind, or spirit, and how to incorporate within it the unending creative destruction, conflicts, reversals, unintended consequences, reconciliations, renewed conflict, which appear to be the enduring traits of all these aspects of reality. He will do this by his theory of dialectic. But such a totalizing philosophy, seeking to comprehend total reality, is a metaphysics, a study of the nature of total reality. Here Hegel runs into a problem. Is metaphysics any longer possible? The empiricists, beginning with John Locke, had taken a hard line with regard to metaphysics. To the empiricists, metaphysics makes grandiose claims about the whole of reality as being one or many, material or mental, permanent or in flux. These large statements, Locke said, can't answer the empiricist's question. How do you know? Based upon what observation or data is your claim? Locke also raised the more fundamental question. Is the human mind equipped for such metaphysical excursions into total reality? Or are there limits as to what the mind can know? And Locke offered this advice to philosophers. Don't try to be a master builder of a great metaphysical system. It is enough to be an underlaborer, removing the rubbish of past metaphysics. Then came Hume, who carried on the empiricist attack upon metaphysics. Metaphysics is worthless as knowledge and even meaningless, according to Hume, because the statements made by metaphysics fail to pass the empiricist test of knowledge and meaning, to show from what sense impressions these statements are derived. Hume's second argument against metaphysics raised again the point that metaphysics attempts to go beyond the limits of human understanding, which is confined to sense impression. Therefore, metaphysics is impossible. Commit it to the flames, says Hume, for it contains only illusion. But then Western philosophy moves on to Kant, who fights back against Hume's skepticism and defends the certainty of science by pointing to the a priori categories of the mind as the necessary and universal conditions of scientific knowledge. As we have seen, however, a high price was paid for the certainty that Kant provided for scientific knowledge. The price was that we cannot know things as they really are in themselves. We know only things as they appear to us through the universal and necessary categories of the human understanding. We cannot know things in themselves, things as they are in reality, independent of the categories by which we have to understand them. Metaphysics, however, is precisely the attempt to know things as they are in themselves. It is precisely the study of independent reality. Since Kant claims that we cannot know things in themselves, he argues that metaphysics is impossible, that the nature of reality, which metaphysics seeks to know, is unknowable to us. The empiricists and Kant declared that metaphysics is impossible. What route, if any, to a metaphysics of total human experience is open, then, to Hegel in this situation? The Kantian turn in philosophy had given primacy to mind, had made mind the lawgiver to nature, such that whatever we know is in part due to our own concepts. But Kant had placed severe limitations on these concepts. To construct through these concepts a metaphysics which seeks knowledge of a total reality is impossible. But for Hegel, metaphysics is possible. Hegel accepted from Kant the primacy of the mind's concepts in determining what we know. But he had 3 objections to Kant's restrictions on the pure concepts. he refused any limitation on the number of concepts. Second, he refused to limit them to use in sensory experience. And third, Hegel refused to limit the knowledge gained by the categories to the status of mere appearance. He argued that the categories do pertain to reality. It is reality itself which these concepts tell us about. We can now see what Hegel wants to do. He wants to build upon Kant and upon the Kantian turn in philosophy, upon the primacy which Kant gave to the pure rational concepts. Hegel wants to keep this primacy which concepts have over sense impressions, but he also wants to build upon the Romantics and to be able to be expansive, unlimited, like the Romantics, and to incorporate their new modern sense of the varieties of psychological, religious, historical, cultural, and creative experience, and of many new kinds of knowledge. He wants, therefore, to be unlimited in using rational concepts to understand this vast variety of experience and knowledge. He wishes also to bring into his philosophy romantic opposition, conflict, irony, contradiction, paradox, and to express the new sense after the French Revolution of the turnabouts of historical change. To achieve these goals, and also to incorporate the truth embedded in rationalism and empiricism, Hegel has to construct a new theory of reality as the heart of his metaphysics. What is this new theory of reality which Hegel constructs? Hegel has found a way to bring the vast reaches of the human spirit into unification in a theory. The totality of concepts used in the vast stretches of all knowledge, all the arts and sciences, religion, political thought, history, they are unified in the absolute mind or absolute spirit, or God, which is ultimate reality. Reality is thus the vast and complex totality of rational concepts, and this totality constitutes absolute mind or absolute spirit, or God. The real, says Hegel, is the rational, and the rational is the real. This totality of thought is absolute and characterizes absolute spirit, in contrast to finite minds such as ours. It is objective mind, in contrast to the subjectivity of human minds. Here we have identified Hegel's theory of reality, the metaphysical theory of absolute idealism. As we have already seen, idealism is the name of the type of metaphysical theory which claims that reality has the characteristics of mind or thought, that reality is rational, logical, or spiritual. Absolute idealism is a subtype of idealism. And now let's unpack absolute idealism into the following parts. 1. Reality as totality of conceptual truth. Absolute idealism is the claim that reality is rational, conceptual totality, that reality is an absolute mind, or the mind of God, an integrated and total structure of conceptual truths. 2. Reality as absolute mind. For Hegel, reality is absolute mind, consisting of the totality of conceptual truth, which reveals itself in all areas of human experience and knowledge, from logic to physics to biology, from history and politics to art, religion, and philosophy. 3. The real is the rational, and the rational is the real. Reality is this vast structure of rational concepts. Like Plato, Hegel claims that the rational, the concept, the idea, this is what is real. In Hegel's own famous words, the real is the rational, and the rational is the real. Hegel fills out in rich and concrete detail this vision of the absolute, of absolute spirit, of a God who is total reality and truth, who reveals himself to our finite minds in every area of human knowledge. You may want to respond to Hegel by agreeing that empiricism is shallow, and that Hegel's absolute idealism offers what the human spirit craves to understand, the meaning of human experience, and the totality of truth to be found in the arts, sciences, history, religion, politics. You may also find yourself agreeing with Hegel about the nature of reality, because when you want to understand the reality that you have to confront in your job, in your family, and the political tensions that greet you in the daily news, you find that you have to think about these things. You have to penetrate them to find what they mean. You have to understand the psychological or social or political concepts that are involved. You don't solve these problems of your life by getting a batch of human sense impressions. 4. The rational is the existent object more deeply understood. Hegel is right, you may say. The real is the rational. But what about existence? the factual objects of the world, the vast realms of physical and organic nature, and human societies. Have all these forms of existence no reality for Hegel? Is only the rational, the conceptual, real? Hegel's answer, in his own words, is that the reality of the rational concepts, quote, is not another object than the existence, it is the same object, more deeply understood, end quote. Absolute idealism claims to penetrate existence to find the rational conceptual truth, which is its core or kernel. Here you can see an important distinction between Plato's theory of concepts or ideas and Hegel's theory of concepts. For Plato, the eternal and immutable ideas exist separately and independently in their own intelligible realm of being, as distinct from the merely sensible realm of things in flux. However, the separation of the eternal forms from the sensible world of things created a difficulty for Plato's philosophy, which was noted even by Plato himself. How can the relation of the immutable forms of the intelligible world to the changing things of the sensible world be explained? For Hegel, on the other hand, the rational concepts have no separate independent existence apart from the concrete world of things, but constitute their rational core. Hegel thus avoids Plato's problem, but creates one for himself. If the real is exclusively the rational concept, then are not the concrete observable objects of nature irrational and unreal? But if they have no reality, how can penetrating them to the rational core be explained? 5. Reality is knowable by its intelligible rational structures. You can see how strongly Hegel denies the claim of Hume and Kant that reality is unknowable. Hegel is as confident a rationalist as Plato had been. To Hegel, whatever is rational. By that he means that everything has an intelligible structure or core, which human reason, with the power and flexibility of its concepts, can grasp. Every aspect of human experience is knowable through its underlying rational structure. 6. Absolute mind as unity in diversity. Absolute mind is a unified totality of all rational truth, covering all areas of experience and knowledge, yet organizing all this diversity into a coherent unity. The absolute or absolute mind is, says Hegel, a unity in diversity, a single identity incorporating all these differences. It is a one that includes the many. 7. The task of metaphysics. The task of metaphysics is to show the diversity of components of reality, their limits and interconnections, in a unified totality. Absolute mind, Hegel says, is the one single reality which reveals itself to us in the concepts of all the areas of human experience. Different aspects of this reality are revealed in different areas of human experience. This single reality manifests itself to us in ordinary experience, in logic and natural science, in psychology, politics and history, in painting, poetry and architecture, and in religion and philosophy. We understand physics and art and psychology by means of the concepts used in each of these fields. Each of these areas of reality yields a true view of reality, but each yields only a partial, limited, and incomplete view. Physics, for example, reveals one important aspect of reality, but it is only one aspect. It is not the whole of reality. Here the voice of the Romantics is speaking. The task of metaphysics, of a theory of all reality, is to identify all of the dimensions or aspects of reality, all of the ways in which reality, in its great variety and complexity, is grasped by our concepts, and to show the limits of each dimension of reality and how they are interconnected. This is the meaning of reality for Hegel, that reality is the whole truth, grasped by our rational concepts. Reality is the absolute truth. It is the totality and synthesis of all partial and limited truth. Reality, properly understood, is the totality of truth of absolute mind. This breathtaking vision of absolute total reality is linked to the method by which it is known. This is the famous method of dialectic, to which we now turn. Dialectic is one of the oldest of philosophic concepts. Its earliest appearance is in very ancient Greek thought, around 150 years before Socrates. Anaximander proposed that all things arise from the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite. This primal reality is not one of the classical elements, but an originary substratum beyond form, from which all opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry, emerge. What sets Anaximander apart is his insight into the structure of becoming. The idea that when one element or force dominates the others, it does so unjustly, and thus must eventually pay reparation. In his one surviving fragment, he says, quote, "From where things arise, to there they return again, according to necessity, for they give justice and reparation to one another for their injustice, according to the ordering of time." End quote. Later, around the time of the birth of Socrates, Heraclitus wrote that all is strife. Everything turns into its opposite. Socrates himself meant by dialectic the use of argument in order to make the opponent contradict himself in the course of the famous Socratic method, with the result that Socrates would then resolve the contradiction and be able to move to a true definition of the concept. In the Republic, Plato meant by dialectic, as we have seen, the highest level of knowledge, a stage in which opposition or contradiction has been overcome. The stage of knowledge which Plato calls dialectic is one on which each of the forms is known in its own immutable truth, and all forms are known in their relationship to each other and to the idea of the good. Hegel is the master of dialectic. He incorporates Heraclitus, Socrates, and Plato in his theory of dialectic and offers the most completely developed, ambitious, and powerful theory of dialectic that has ever been formulated. What does Hegel mean by dialectic? Dialectic, he says, is a synthesis of opposites. Every concept, as we think about it, begins to show us its limitations and passes over into its opposite, into the very negation of itself. As a result, dialectic in the Heraclitean sense of opposition, conflict, polarity, or contradiction characterizes all human thought. As an example of each concept passing over into its opposite, we may turn to Heraclitus in ancient Greek philosophy and his claim that everything is changing. Heraclitus' concept, once it is reflected upon, begins to show its own limitations, and it passes over into its very opposite, in Parmenides' claim that nothing changes, that reality is eternally what it is. This shows the dialectical opposition, conflict, contradiction, or polarity between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Hegel labels the first concept, that of Heraclitus, the thesis. He calls the second concept, that of Parmenides, which arises to oppose it, the antithesis. But then Hegel points out, not unlike Socrates, that this conflict, this opposition, in which thesis and antithesis struggle against each other, can be overcome. There emerges finally, when we think through this conflict, the thought of a new concept which will resolve the conflict, unify the opposing concepts, retain what is true and valuable in each of them. This third concept Hegel calls the synthesis. Plato's philosophy provided the synthesis for the thesis of Heraclitus and the antithesis of Parmenides. Plato retained Heraclitus' concept of change, but confined it to the sensible world. Plato retained from Parmenides the concept of the unchanging, but confined it to the intelligible world. And Plato unified or synthesized thesis and antithesis by going beyond them in his own philosophy, which was more complete, more true than either of the previous concepts. Here we have the basic diagram of Hegel's theory of dialectic. Dialectic is a process which consists of three stages, or moments. For this reason, Hegel's theory of dialectic is called triadic. The process of dialectic moves from a first stage or moment, the thesis, to a second stage or moment, which negates, opposes, or contradicts the first, the antithesis, and this opposition is overcome by a third stage in which a new concept, the synthesis, emerges as a higher truth which transcends them. Synthesis has these three functions. First, it cancels the conflict between thesis and antithesis. Second, it preserves or retains the element of truth within the thesis and antithesis. And third, it transcends the opposition and raises up or sublates the conflict into a higher truth. This triadic process of dialectic, says Hegel, is not restricted to the history of philosophy. Far from it. For Hegel, dialectic as the triadic process of the synthesis of opposites is the rhythm of all reality. The rational conceptual truths which underlie all the areas of human experience and knowledge are not static, but in dialectical movement, from the thesis to opposing antithesis to reconciling synthesis. Absolute mind, which is the totality of these concepts, is thus itself a process, revealing its truths to us dialectically, unfolding them stage by stage, from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, to our finite minds. We, in turn, grasp these unfolding truths in our developing knowledge. The whole of what is known at any historical period is what absolute mind has dialectically revealed or manifested at that point. If we compare Hegel's theory of dialectic with that of Plato, we find some striking differences. First, whereas for Plato, dialectic as the highest level of knowledge has as its goal the removal of contradictions, for Hegel, contradiction can never be overcome. The generating of contradiction, of opposites and their synthesis, is in Hegel's view the very nature of rational thought, and thus of reality itself. Second, for Plato, dialectic yields the immutable static truth of the forms. For Hegel, dialectic yields the dynamically changing truths of the concepts. Hegel offers us a vision of dialectical reason, moving dynamically through tension, opposition, conflict, polarity, contradiction, toward resolution in a synthesis. Hegel's view of dialectical reason is distinct from Plato's reason, which grasps the pure forms in their identity and their interrelatedness, from Descartes' mathematical model of reason, which intuits self-evident axioms and deduces necessary conclusions from them, and from the Enlightenment's theory of two kinds of reason, the scientific, analytical, and organizing reason of Newton, and the natural light, intuitive reason of Locke. And third, for Plato, dialectic yields forms or ideas which are rational and timeless, derived not from the visible but from the intelligible world, and represent a transcendent realm of truth. But for Hegel, conceptual truth is immanent in existent things, in the changing processes of the world, and is time-bound. Then, does it not follow that absolute mind, consisting of conceptual truth, is not a transcendent realm of truth, but is merely tied to, immanent in, the changing processes of the world, and to time? How then can Hegel refer to absolute mind as God, or as absolute, or as a totality? Has not Hegel reduced absolute mind to the partial, incomplete, evolving thought of merely finite mind? How can this partial, changing, finite truth be called God? Hegel remains ambiguous on this point, perhaps deliberately. Despite these significant differences between Plato and Hegel on the theory of dialectic, there are important agreements. First, both regard dialectic as the highest level of knowledge in that it seeks to grasp reality in the form of underlying rational conceptual truths. Both regard dialectic as a superior, more profound approach to reality than sense perception or than the method of understanding with which science operates. Second, like Plato, Hegel uses the method of dialectic to construct a great totalizing philosophy in which rational concepts organize and synthesize all aspects of reality into a single, interconnected, meaningful whole. Dialectic is both an essential character of reality itself and the method for understanding reality. It is both the rhythmic movement of all human thought and history and the method for understanding them. We will now turn to the dialectical fate of the human spirit in its pilgrimage through history.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.